Constructivism Theory, Six-Day War, 1967. Relations between Israel and its neighbors were not normalized since after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. First, it is important to understand the basics about the disputed territory in and around modern-day Israel. Many Israeli Jews believe that they were entitled to lay claim to the land based on a promise from God, while most Palestinian Arabs whose ancestors lived there for hundreds of years believed they were rightful inhabitants. Prior to the start of the war, attacks conducted against Israel by fledgling Palestinian guerrilla groups based in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan had increased, which due to that leading to costly Israeli reprisals. In the spring 1967, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser mobilized troops in the Sinai Peninsula, requested the removal of United Nations peacekeeping personnel, and blocked Israeli ships from passing through the Straits of Tiran. Moves designed to further disrupt Israel's safety and economic stability in hopes of eliminating the country and reclaiming its land. In the period leading up to June 1967, tensions became dangerously heightened. In reaction to the mobilization of Egyptian forces along the Israeli border in the Sinai Peninsula, Israel launched a series of preemptive airstrikes against Egyptian airfields. The first strike strategy was a resounding success, as Israeli air assaults decimated the Egyptian and Syrian air forces before their planes had even left the tarmac. By mid-May, Egypt and Syria had formalized an alliance, along with Jordan and Iraq soon after. The countries began to increase their military presence along their shared borders with Israel. Viewing these actions as antagonistic, the Israeli government decided to move swiftly and act offensively. Jordan's government then entered the fight by starting combat operations in West Jerusalem, where they faced and were quickly overmatched by Israeli defensive counterattacks.
Moving on to the factors that lead to the Six-Day War. Firstly is historical factors. The concerns of Arab world leaders from Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq and Kuwait have arisen since the establishment of Israel in Palestine in 1948. Palestine has gone through their controversy about their states in many histories, and the newest, which is the Israel, were the most divided. They got the perception about Israel's capabilities that supported by American and Britain to further expand their country's borders past another Arab country. However, only Egypt, Jordan and Syria decided to fight with Israel after feeling the sovereignty of their territory increasingly challenged following to the construction of settlements of the growing Zionist Jewish population. The ongoing border fighting with Syria, disputes with Jordan over water rights, and the closures of the distance of Israel's cities with Arab artillery put Israel leadership under great pressure before the Arabs can unite their military. The crisis complicates the relation of Israel and its nearby Arab neighbors so much that makes the Israel themselves feel the need to show their true stance so that the Arab world does not underestimate their presence in the Middle East region. So it shows that the behavior of actors is shaped by history of the actors involved. Next, the factor that lead to this war is about political factor. It is important to understand that the social relationship between Israel and America, Britain and the Soviet Union. Alexander Wert in 1992 said that anarchy is a state created by states. This means that social relations between America and Israel represent an intersubjective structure, which means the ideas and beliefs shared between the two states. This change or reinforcement ultimately depends on the beliefs and ideas held by both states. If these beliefs and ideas change, social relationship can also change. This means that anarchy can be interpreted in different ways depending on the meaning given to it by the actor. This war is giving a chance to the great powers on that time like America, Britain and the Soviet Union to play their part in order the Arab countries have always under their influence. Additional, economic interests also had influenced the British when the Six-Day War began on 5th June 1967. The public knew that the Arab state was indeed important to the British. Even in that situation, the importance of Israel to the British economy outweighed the importance of the British economy in the Arab countries. So it influenced Britain to give support to Israel's action in the war. So it means that the conflict between Israel and Arab countries was because of the political factors that give a value to the certain parties.
On June 5th, 1967, the largest armed conflict in a decades-long clash over Holy Land in the Middle East erupted.
Next, parties involved in Six-Day War 1967. There are 4 combatants in this war, which is Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The Six-Day War was a brief but bloody conflict fought in June 1967 between Israel and the Arab states of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Hidayah is a soldier and statesman who led Israel to dramatic victories over its Arab neighbors. Dayan was appointed to the Ministry of Defense and he directed operations during the Six-Day War. The term constructivism was adopted by Nicholas Onuf in 1989 and introduced as people and societies construct or constitute each other. The main assumption of constructivists is that the fundamental structures of international politics are social and these structures shape actors' identities and interests. Constructivism theory discusses about the issue of anarchy in the international system. At a simple conceptual level, Alexander Went claimed that the realist conception of anarchy does not explain enough why conflict happens between states. The main thing is how anarchy is understood, and Went argues that anarchy is what states make of it. Norms, identity, and ideas are the key factors in the constructivist theory.
Based on constructivism theory, international relations are more dynamic or complex. Behavior of multiple states can be different at one time, or behavior of one state can be different at different times. Set of ideas are the important part in constructivism theory because every state have their own identities, that is, history, culture, languages, values. Identities matter because it gives actors interest, and those interests tell us how actors might behave or react. Every state have different pictures or images of reality and they can change their perception. There is no need to be fixated on one perspective only. Now we're going to see how the constructivism theory view the Six-Day Wars between Arab and Israel. First one, we have to understand the bellicosity of Israel's defense policy. We know that perspective or idea based on the state's identities. One of the identities is history. Israel have been gone through with recent and painful history of Jews, and we can see how the history influenced them to form a new ideas of their military policies. And one of example of Israel painful history is when the Nazis systematically murdered approximately 6 million Jews as well as millions of others. Now we're going to see how the Israel built their new perspective and idea. Egypt announced hostility to Israel. Egypt also set its military to its highest alertness level, expelled UN emergency forces from the shared Sinai border, strengthened its forces on the same border, closed the important threats of Tehran to Israeli ships, and fomented a more favorable balance of power by signing alliance with Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. So, in view of Israel, this situation seemed to be a serious threat for their continuation's existence. Israel responded to this threat with swift and decisive attack, in which 90% of Egypt's air forces were suddenly destroyed without warning. Similar surprise attack was conducted in Syria. The situation had given advantage to Israel, where it allows Israel to capture the Gaza Strip and West Bank in only 3 days. The most powerful and overwhelming alliance in the history of the Arab world was completely defeated in 6 days as a direct result of Israel's threat perception and military policies. Based on constructivism theory, Israel ideas and perspective were driven by the thoughts that they are being targeted and threatened. States cannot be entirely sure of the actions of another state, which create uncertainties and require significant strategic planning. Israel has constructed an idea that the way to ensure continued existence against such uncertainty is through power. States strive to be more powerful than other states because that is deemed the only way to determine unpredictable threats. Now we move to Arab, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq. By the mid-1916, Syrian-backed Palestinian guerrillas had begun staging attacks across the Israeli border, provoking reprisals, raids from the Israel Defense Forces. The second one, we can see the strategies of Egypt in strengthen their defense. The first one they do is remove the UNEF station in Sinai. Second one, they close the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping and institute an ineffective blockade of the port city of Eilat in southern Israel. On May 30, King Hussein of Jordan arrived in Cairo to sign a mutual defense pact with Egypt, placing Jordanian forces under the Egyptian command. Shortly after that, Iraq joined the alliance. So based on the previous slide, we acknowledge that Arab countries have to form an alliance in order to strengthen their defense. The second one, Arab countries did not start with attacking Israel. However, they create an ideas that can trigger the Israel. Now we can see clearly the idea of constructivism theory, where there is a comparison of perspective and approaches used by the Israel and Arab. Israel tend to be more taking an aggressive action and approaches by conducted a surprise attack to Syria and Egypt, while the Arab country take a slow step and passive by limit the resources and movement of Israel.
Next, the suggestions and recommendations to prevent war while implementing the constructivism theory is to cater to the other country's needs, to establish strong relationship with surrounding nations, and to have neutral country. Our first suggestion is to cater to the other country's needs in order to gain mutual dependency. For example, North Korea and China, where they are both strong countries that values military strength, remain friendly for the benefits gained in other sectors. Our next suggestion is to establish strong relationship with surrounding nations in order to gain firm foothold in the area and to increase the country's survival rate. For example, the establishment of European Union, where all the countries in the Union receive tremendous benefits in terms of support. Lastly, to have future-friendly countries like Israel, Egypt, and USA. After the Six-Day War, Egypt had actually severed their relationship with USA, a country that is friendly to Israel. Egypt and Israel continued to be at war right up until Egypt had eased their relationship with USA. Upon receiving USA aid, Egypt had managed to get Israel to sign a peace treaty between the two countries.
As a conclusion, the discipline of international relations benefits from constructivism as it addresses issues and concepts that are neglected by mainstream theories, especially realism.